With the recent controversy exploding in the fandom over the end of the latest novel arc, it got me thinking about just how unexpected this whole thing was. It's the first time I've seen the fandom get this heated. Then I remembered the exact same thing happened in Arc 7 with Wallachia and the Gladiator Island chapters. Then I remembered it happened in Arc 6 too. Back then, people accused the arc of being unoriginal and boring. I even recalled something similar happening back in 2016 with Episode 18. So I realized there's always some controversy to talk about. And since I want to close out the year with one last video, I said to myself, why not do a recap of all the controversies the fandom has been through? Since, for better or worse, I'm pretty plugged into all of this. But before we jump in, a huge thank you to the channel members. This section is going to be a bit long, so please bear with me. On the Spanish channel, a big shout out to Lamaza, Gabriel, Benja Torres, Tiago, Zer14, Thimaro, Benjae Dino, Grevilea, Alexis, Santi, Elias Atlas, Buenas 2, Flancito Canelon, Pedro Tobias, Delango, Usha, Sebastian, Ragna Video, and Norvac. Sorry if I don't go into detail with the greetings, but this is the last video of the year, and I want to wrap up everything I owe this year within this year. Anyway, I think I'll be adding a new tier for shoutouts soon because there are seriously too many of you, and I have less and less time for greetings. And soon, with my studies, less time to edit. On the English side of the community, a shout out and thanks to the new members, Vendels, who has taken the trouble to comment on my videos, the guy with the Shaula profile pic, Herbert, the guy with the username I can't say out loud due to YouTube policies, and Arwar, a Spanish follower who for some reason paid for the English membership. Thank you, and thank you so much for everything. Welcome to every ReZero controversy. Since 2016. Let's start with one of the most recent incidents. A moment where fans basically demanded that Subaru end his life because, according to them, it was time to do it. The funny thing is, they were asking for this even though in the previous season, Subaru had just learned to value his own life. We're in 2024. Things weren't looking good for our protagonist. Crush had been infected, EMILIA was kidnapped, and the city was a disaster. So people thought it was right to ask Subaru to redo the loop. After all, according to them, it was the smartest move to make at that moment. To this day, it still blows my mind how casually people can ask someone to off themselves like it's nothing. Yes, I know it's fiction, and I know Subaru can redo things, but it's weird to see this reaction when we just came off Season 2, a season where Subaru understood that dying for the slightest problem wasn't the answer. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Subaru should avoid using his power entirely. That's impossible. But there's a difference between using it when it's inevitable versus using it at the first sign of trouble. I know there are more nuances involved in this decision, like Crush asking Subaru not to sacrifice himself for her, or Ricardo saying he's fine with losing his arm, but none of that mattered. What mattered at that moment was what the fandom was saying. Look, I partly understand the fandom's frustration. I think it all boils down to a timing issue. Season 3 had the bad luck of premiering 4 years after Season 2. By then, it's normal for the casual audience to forget a lot of plot details. Obviously, since I pump out content regularly, I don't forget, but I can't expect that from a casual viewer. So, while there was some backlash in the comments back then, ultimately I can't help but be understanding and chalk this whole controversy up to simply the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe this timing issue will be fixed by releasing seasons closer together instead of every 4 years. Although being too active and following the series can also be a problem, as we'll see in the next case. It's 2021. People were hyped about the end of Arc 6, but suddenly the new arc started, and a large portion of the fans began labeling everything happening in Wallachia as filler. What happened here? Well, to be exact, people didn't hate the start of Arc 7 entirely. If they didn't hate it, it's because the initial part of the Wallachia arc covered the fallout of Arc 6. We saw Rem and Subaru finally interact after nearly 10 years of the maid being in a coma. But once that part wrapped up and Arc 7 really began, things took a turn for the worse. You see, a huge reason for the immense fanaticism surrounding Arc 6 is that it was the culmination of the past seasons, specifically Season 3. But Arc 7, unfortunately, doesn't have that same interesting background because Subaru is teleported out of nowhere to an unknown territory without his usual companions. We don't have Otto to support Subaru. We don't have EMILIA to give Subaru the will to push beyond his limits. We only had an amnesiac Rem and Rui, Subaru's former enemy. On top of that, shortly after the arc starts, Subaru gets separated from both of them, the only people he knew in the entire nation. So from here on out, The story is forced to make Subaru interact with nothing but brand new characters. Not having familiar faces made many think the plot made no sense or was boring. In fact, I remember people genuinely saying this arc was boring simply because they didn't care about the current cast of characters. Because the regulars weren't there, the author had to start introducing new characters. But it wasn't enough to just create them. He also had to give them a backstory and motivation so we could empathize with them. That's how we got Flop, someone who, while similar to Otto in profession, ends up being a very different version of our favorite merchant. We're also introduced to two sisters who, I'm sure it's impossible not to point out, are the equivalents of Rem and Ram in this part of the story. I'm talking about Tarita and Mazelda. While both end up having complexes because of the other, the complexes they have are essentially different from the maid sisters. I know you might be wondering why I'm taking the time to be this specific. It's because I actually really enjoyed the interactions and roles of Flop, Mazelda, and Tarita. At no point did I think they were unnecessary characters. I just thought about how well the author managed to introduce them and make them work with the protagonist. At the very least, I want to believe that if I remember their conflict in detail, it's because Tappei did a minimally good job creating them for this part of the story. Although I should also point out that when I read all this, I did it after Arc 7 had already finished. So I can't speak for those who followed the work weekly, but I can tell you that the experience of reading Re:Zero once an arc is finished is night and day compared to reading it week to week. I think it's better to evaluate an arc when it's over rather than during its release. I'm sure of this because there are records of Arc 6 and the amnesia subplot being rated as boring while it was being published. Which brings us to... We are in Arc 6, specifically May 2017. That day, episode 32 was published, the episode where Subaru loses his memories. And people exploded because they thought Tappei didn't know what else to do other than nerf Subaru. They considered that subplot unnecessary. Returning to the problem of following the work week to week, the same thing happened in Arc 6. There are records in forums showing that people didn't take Subaru's amnesia very well when it happened. Obviously, now we know it was necessary for the idea the author wanted to develop, but people back then had no way of knowing what we know now. In retrospect, this is actually pretty funny to me. You see, Tappei has a cyclical style with Subaru. In every arc, he always confronts him with a side of himself he wasn't aware he had, or if he was, it was a side he handled very clumsily. In Arc 5, for example, he becomes aware that maybe he isn't as much of a loser as he thought, and Arc 6 helps him overcome this insecurity using the amnesia device. As you can see, the work always tries to challenge the protagonist in one way or another. That's why the complaints about Arc 6 make me laugh in hindsight. The complaint that recycling the plot of putting Subaru in a tight spot was unnecessary. The funny thing is, almost every series does this recycling to a greater or lesser extent. For example, in shonen anime, essentially every plot can be boiled down to an enemy appears who is stronger than the last one. The Re:Zero way is simply to wreck Subaru, and based on the hard time he goes through, develop the protagonist with a focus that will help him solve whatever the current problem of the arc is. Although now that I think about it, I wonder how many professional authors have changed the development of their plots due to fan pressure. I'm just grateful Tappei didn't cave to the internet pressure and stood firm in his decision to write Arc 6 exactly as he planned. But sometimes, sticking to your original goal doesn't necessarily save you from getting roasted by the internet, and we'll see that clearly with a case you already know. It's 2016. Re:Zero is having moderate success. Not great, not terrible. But suddenly, episode 18 drops, and for the first time, Re:Zero experiences something close to breaking the internet. Honestly, I think 2016 was the closest the series ever got to genuinely breaking the internet, which is a bit sad because the series has had better moments since then. But back to the topic, I remember this incident surprised even me. In those days, I didn't even watch anime and was focused on other things, but even inside my bubble, I heard about this fandom war. You know how it went. Rem fans fought for their queen, and EMILIA fans did the same. Although I have to admit, it was hard not to understand the fanaticism for Rem. After all, it's undeniable that in the first season, Rem had a more active role, and EMILIA, she was just the damsel in distress. Unironically, I think we should be somewhat grateful this happened. Because while I appreciate that the current seasons of ReZero have moderate success, let's remember the franchise can afford this moderate success today, thanks to the boom that was Season 1. I'd love to give you examples of what it was like to live through that era, but since I joined the fandom after this, it's hard to give a first-hand account. However, even though I can't give examples based on my experience, I found a graph showing how interest in ReZero skyrocketed on July 31st, 2016, specifically after the scene in episode 18. I know REM's popularity isn't necessarily the only indicator of the phenomenon that episode 18 was, but there were other signs back then that helped this perception. For example, on Reddit, the discussion thread for episode 18 was the most upvoted and most commented thread of the entire year. Years had to pass for other anime to take that record, which eventually happened with future episodes of My Hero Academia and Attack on Titan. Plus, the staff at White Fox took the trouble to buy ad space just to promote that specific episode because they sensed it could go viral. And they were right. And well, what can I say about Twitter's reaction to the episode? Chaos. But not everything can be sunshine and rainbows, and we'll see that now with an incident that was also recent and that hopefully won't happen again. Imagine you're an animator for the show. Not just a random animator, but a lead one. And among your duties is creating the promotional art for the season. So you excitedly post your work, and someone comes along implying your work is trash and that it sucks. So you apologize, even though you shouldn't, and then you delete the tweet. What you just heard isn't something that happened once. It happened several times. It happened to various staff members animating ReZero, and it even happened to the author of Mushoku Tensei. And all of this was caused by a certain sector of the ReZero fandom itself. Basically, there's a certain side of the fandom that is very, very toxic. They claim to be fans and love the work, but they have no problem sending death threats to the people working hard to bring us the animated episodes. Look, I understand you might not agree with certain adaptation choices. I, for example, don't agree with how the Teresia episode was adapted, but my anger doesn't give me the right to go and threaten a central figure at White Fox, arguing that he's to blame for the things I don't like. Yes, I know it sounds like I'm exaggerating, but in reality, what I just narrated actually happened. The saddest part of the matter is that this type of harassment, for some reason I don't understand, has some support from a part of the fandom. But well, I guess there are intense people everywhere. Even I have experienced bad treatment from a certain toxic side of the English and Spanish fandoms. It's happened on my English channel where I publish my videos, and just because I use an AI voice, they think I'm a content farm and leave comments like this. Meanwhile, on the Latin side of the fandom, for some reason, there are certain communities that simply don't allow me to promote my ReZero videos in their ReZero groups. But anyway, I imagine there will always be a weird side to the fandom, and I can only hope the good side of the community will always outweigh the bad side. But while we're here, there's another controversy from the fandom toward the ReZero novel illustrator, Otsuka. You see, he was always criticized for how he drew the minors in the show. People didn't like that he defined the pelvic area on little girls like that. In fact, some artists say he doesn't necessarily have to mark it, since he could just leave that part flat and call it a day. He was also criticized for how he ended up illustrating certain characters. For example, when Pandora appeared, the novel described her as the most beautiful woman in the world. But when the illustrator created her official design, he drew her in a way some considered a lowly. On top of that, it didn't help that when he released an official illustration of her for her anime debut, he released a somewhat cancelable image. At least, it was cancelable enough that he had to delete the tweet and re-upload it with certain modifications. Believe me, I'd love to show you the original image, but YouTube is a bit sensitive about that topic. However, I will show you the edited image he had to upload after people complained. Let's just say that in the original image, the only thing covering the villain's lower half was the doll next to her. Added to that, because Otsuka made several mistakes when illustrating certain things, people started questioning him for his continuous errors. For example, in this image, the one supposedly attacking Joshua, Julius's younger brother, isn't Lei, but Roy. Yet, this illustration error made it to the final print. This mistake was so serious that a few months ago, the author had to republish that novel to update the canon to match his illustrator's error. There are several mistakes like this, and now that I think about it, it would be good to make a short recapping all of this. But returning to the issue of how he draws the girls in the show, this whole matter took an interesting turn. In a recent interview, it was revealed that the person demanding those designs was the author himself. Meaning, it's not that Otsuka draws them that way by choice, but it's a request from Teppei himself. And this happened with bad timing again. Because just months before this revelation, old tweets from the author were found where he made jokes about lolicon. You can imagine the kind of things people were saying. But anyway, let's move on to the two most important incidents of recent years, which are very related to each other. Imagine being told a story for about 4 months, and suddenly, the author pulls out a narrative device that automatically makes a huge part of what you just read non-canon. Well, that's what happened in August 2022. We were in the middle of the Arc 7 release, specifically on Gladiator Island. Due to Subaru's power malfunctioning, various irregularities started happening. Since his power wasn't working as it should, things got complicated to the point where he couldn't save anyone. But thanks to finding the cause of his power failure, he was able to redo things, and doing so made the consequences of the arc disappear for some readers. Obviously, a certain part of the audience back then didn't like this. In fact, many used this incident to keep arguing that Arc 7 is terrible and that ReZero ended in Arc 6. It also didn't help that the author complimented what happened here with a side story called Brotherhood of Pleiades. And that genuinely makes me sad because I personally consider this side novel the best non-main novel in all of ReZero. Seeing people hate on this just because of how Volume 31 ended, well, it leaves a bad taste in my mouth. But who would have thought this incident was just the prelude to something bigger? Which brings us to the final point of this video. Well, I don't think I need to spend much time on this. After all, it happened recently. If complaining about redoing a single volume is understandable, now imagine that magnitude, but with an entire arc. An arc that lasted 5 volumes. This is kind of funny to me because I remember seeing ReZero fans making fun of how the One Punch Man fandom couldn't advance the plot due to constant manga redraws. Who knew the ReZero author would do something similar or even worse? To give you an idea, Arc 9 started almost 2 years ago. And in those 2 years, the fandom witnessed various subplots we had been waiting for. The return of Rem, the revelation of Al's past, and other secrets of that caliber. But none of that mattered because it was all deleted. However, this feels more painful than usual because, while before we at least had the consolation that Subaru remembered everything, now not even he knows in detail everything that happened. But we have to establish an interesting distinction here. Even though this wasn't to everyone's liking, that doesn't mean the decision to rewind lacks logic within the saga. It makes sense, but at the cost of nuking many of the fandom's expectations. Will the author be able to prove to us in retrospect that this reset was worth it with the things to come in the future? I don't know, but personally, I think something similar to the Todd named chapter situation will happen. You see, in the Wallachia arc, there was a character whose past sparked some curiosity. When the moment came to learn about him, the character breaks the fourth wall and just openly tells you he has no plans to tell you anything about it. Some loved this form of expression, as it really fit his essence, while others simply labeled it as stupid. At the time, I thought it was bad writing, but now that time has passed and I reread that part, I feel like the final presentation we got of Todd was actually a brilliant move. Now maybe we just have to wait for time to pass and revisit our assessment of the Great Reset. I'm not saying you're definitely going to like it, but after reading the author's entire work and side novels, I trust he has something cooked up that will make us feel that even though the events of Arc 9 were erased, it was for something that will be worth it later. But that's all for today. I hope you liked this compilation. Remember that a like and a comment help the algorithm more than you know, so please consider leaving one. But tell me, what did you think of the controversies of the series?